And now we have another wonderful speech from a wonderful speaker that we had last year. Please welcome to the stage our children and family spokesman, Belinda Brown.
So yeah, today I've recently been working on something called the Commission of Inquiry. Sorry? Is it working? Hold on, is that okay? Closer? Oh, thank you, Tom. Yeah. Okay, there we go, thanks. Okay, excellent. So yeah, I've been working, oh yes, excellent, okay. I've been working on something called the Commission of Inquiry into Discrimination Against Christians, and I hope you don't mind if I speak to you about that today. It's about the issue of freedom of speech, and although I'm focusing on this issue as it affects Christians, I actually think it is of relevance to everybody, so I hope that's okay. I presume that people know the extent. I mean, there's been a lot of incidents. They probably don't make the news that much, but there has been sort of every week new cases arising. Things like I don't know if you know Felix Ngoli, for example. He was a Sheffield student. He was kicked out of the social work course because he said in his Facebook post that he disagreed with same-sex marriage. He actually won his case after 4 years, and recently he was applying for his ideal job. He got the ideal job. As he won the sort of competition between the people. As he was the person least likely to discriminate. And then they found out that he'd spoken against same-sex marriage, and he was again deprived of that job. And there are just loads and loads of cases like this, which I could go through, but I won't do, just believe me. So what we're doing at this Commission of Inquiry, we're actually inviting submissions from Christians who've suffered discrimination, injustice, stigma, or hostility. So that's what we're looking at. And I'm going to explain why we're focusing on Christians. I'll come to that. The first thing I did was I just did a big survey about this, and what we came out, so one of the findings was that 56% of people, 56% of people feel that they experience hostility, ridicule, and that sort of thing on account of their faith. But at the same time, they still, a much smaller percentage actually feel the need to hide their faith than feel hostility. I think that's sort of part of being Christian, where people don't hide their faith. I think that, some people might say, well, why should people talk about their beliefs? And that's a fair enough viewpoint. But what really emerged in the data is that while Christians might feel uncomfortable about talking about their viewpoint, those people could engage in LGBT propaganda, and there's absolutely nothing to stop them. I mean, it's like they can promote the whole agenda, LGBTQ plus agenda, as much as they like, and that's totally fine. But if you talk about your faith beliefs, whatever they are, you're going to get in trouble. And one of the things that was very clear was that people didn't feel that they could express their social views or their social attitudes. So only 53% of people feel free to say what they think, and this drops down to 45% in their place of work. we live in a society where the public realm has traditionally been an arena in which all sorts of thoughts and views can be debated, and where people understand that there's a separation between what you say or even think and what you actually do. This was Felix N'Ngoli was a good example of this, because he was fired because of his views, but he won his court case because they said, well, actually, he's never discriminated against anyone. So it's very important to make this distinction between what you think and what you actually do. But this is being encroached on, where you're not actually allowed to think whatever you want to think. This really came out in the qualitative part of the survey. By the way, the survey had, I think we had 1,562 responses. So it was we collected loads of data, and there was loads of qualitative responses. And most of the marginalization, most of the freedom of speech issues came around, they were sort of around LGBTQ plus issues. So what's determined as being acceptable or unacceptable is the extent to which it will fit in with the LGBT agenda. So you can just read these. I mean, I had so much of this material. This is just 3 of the quotes, which you can read themselves. You can read it more easily than me, because if I turn round, I won't, but I've got the speaker there. One of the things which we found was that it was actually, although there was I think it was 18% of people who actually felt that they had been positively disadvantaged in the workplace. I don't know quite how accurate the figure is, because our sample tended to be on the older side, and as I'll go on to show, younger people tended to experience more sort of discrimination and disadvantage than older people. So if we'd had a greater younger sample, discrimination might have come out more clearly. But anyway, these are, this is the sorts of, I think, can you all read that? These are just some examples of the things people were saying. And if you disagree with this agenda, you can lose your job. Now, there is this question here. One of the things that we asked was, is religious discrimination taken as seriously as discrimination against other protected characteristics? And only 22% of people agreed with this. And I think this was an interesting question which needs very careful exploration. So generally, people don't feel that religious discrimination is taken seriously, and the main sources of the discrimination was very often their employers. So exactly the people who were supposed to be protecting against discrimination were actually perpetrating it. Now, one of the issues that I want to look at is that a lot of Christians felt that, if we were Muslim, Muslims aren't discriminated against us in the same way. Now, I want to look at this carefully, because actually, I think that Christians and Muslims have much more in common than, for example, Christians and atheists. We both know what it means to believe in God. We both know how important our faith belief is to our identity. And I think it's quite likely that we have understandings about morals and social arrangements which are much more similar to each other than to mainstream society. And I think that this is a time when faith in general is very much under threat. And I think actually it's a time that we need to draw together, and not a time to sort of draw attention to to differences. And I think that the powers that be would be very keen to see conflict and disagreement between Muslims and Christians. I don't know if you've seen in, I think it's in Ottawa, Canada, there have been absolutely massive protests against sex education. And it's been Muslims and Christians coming together. And I think that this is very important. So when in my responses the people are saying, oh, you know, we get more discrimination against Muslims, I want to look at that because I actually think we don't want conflict. We do want to come together. And so I just want to discuss this a little bit further. What seems to be happening, and these are the quotations, but what seems to be happening is that Muslims are perceived as ethnic minorities, whereas Christians are perceived as part of the establishment. And as I'll go on to discuss, we've got this, you know, if you're part of an ethnic minority, then this kind of comes up higher in our level of discrimination than religion does. So you've got sort of LGBTQ is kind of highest at the top of the sort of gender critical theory. And then they've got, you know, critical race theory. And so some people associate Muslims more with race than with religion. And so in some ways, they will get more protection. And then the Christians are associated with the establishment. And so in some ways, which I'll come on to discuss, they will be, they won't get the same protections as sometimes Muslims get. But I want to be careful about this because the thing which I think we need to be very aware of is that there are different kinds of discrimination going on. So Christians might not, I'll give you some examples of where they feel they're discriminated against, but I know, because I've worked a lot in in areas of sex education, that Muslims have actually done some absolutely fantastic work fighting what's been happening in schools. I mean, they put us to shame in some of the things they've done. It's been really terrific. But when they do so, they're portrayed as extremists. So that seems to be the establishment's trope. When they don't like something Muslims do, they'll be portrayed as extremists. So I think that each sort of different religious group has a different form of discrimination. So while Christians feel, oh, we're being discriminated against in ways Muslims aren't, Muslims are also being discriminated against in ways that Christians aren't. And so we shouldn't let these things divide us. And I'm just going to give you some examples so Muslims can understand what Christians are feeling. So this was an example of, she was a third order Franciscan, and I think she got a job in a school, and she wears a headdress. She wasn't allowed to wear a headdress. And she felt, you know, probably if she'd been a Muslim, she would have been allowed to wear a headdress. And then there was this example of, whilst in a prison, a friend of mine was not allowed to receive a brand new shrink-wrapped copy of the King James Version of the Bible, whereas the Muslims were allowed to receive Islamic texts. And then I worked in the civil service, and I was told to use my lunch break to attend the last Ash Wednesday service before Easter, unlike Muslim colleagues who went to several events at different times, and the manager just looked away. So these are the things that are going on, and you know, and I think it's, you know, we can't just brush it under the carpet. In some ways, Christians receive more discrimination. In some ways, Muslims receive more discrimination. And I think it's very important, actually, at this time to come together, because I do think we've got more that unites us than divides us. I think we've got a lot more that unites us. Now, another thing which I did was look at how people were affected by discrimination according to age. And what I found is that, I'm going to have to, maybe at this point I do need to just take this off, but the younger you are, the more discrimination you actually feel. So, for example, the under 35s are much less likely to feel comfortable talking about their faith beliefs than, say, 65 and older. Let's see, at the when it comes to, so social issues, I feel free to say what I think. The under 35s are much less likely to feel free to say what they think than the 65s and olders. So they feel they're more negative stereotypes. Generally, things are getting, and the younger people are actually the ones who are more likely to be in the workplace. So I think you can see the age divisions as the people who've got more experience of the workplace. So what this shows is that discrimination is seriously increasing. And I think that our public realm needs to be preserved as a free speech space. And if steps are not taken now, things could get much worse. While most of us don't feel driven to hiding our faith, in the future, the pressure to do so could increase if action isn't taken now. Now, this table was I was really quite struck by it, because this is the percentage of people who agree. These are Christians who agree with these different statements. I'll talk a bit more later why we did, anyway. And it's quite, so real marriage is between a man and a woman, 92%. We should avoid having sexual relations before marriage, 86%. It is always wrong to have an abortion, 67%. We were all born male and female, 93%. I strongly suspect that if we talk to other faith groups, we've actually all got very similar views about these things. And I think this is important. And also that our views are radically at odds with mainstream society. So I did also look at, the data that's out there. And so, for example, a YouGov report suggested that 78% of Britons support same-sex marriage, whereas we've got 92% of people Christians feeling that real marriage is between a man and a woman. The Jane O'Zane Foundation, which is an LGBT advocacy group, claimed that 55% of Anglicans believed that same-sex marriage was fine. But the table isn't here, 87% of Anglicans agreed that real marriage is between a man and a woman. So I think her research was a bit dodgy. And the same, if you look at the sort of mainstream views on abortion, they're really very different numbers from the numbers that we were getting from the Christian population. And I think it's quite incredible the extent to which these views have no representation in mainstream society. Now, so saying this, I actually then just came across this newspaper article. Unfortunately, I don't have the date there. I think it was fairly recent. But this is so there's me thinking our views have no representation in mainstream society, but there's recently been research done which shows that 1 in 3 people in their 30s believe that sex outside marriage is wrong. I thought that was really interesting because it suggests that possibly this sex revolution, which we've been in hock to for absolutely ages, perhaps may actually be starting to decline, and attitudes may really be changing, which would be interesting. The other thing that I went on to look at, I wanted to see how your attitude, so your level of traditional belief, affected it shaped the discrimination which you experienced. And there was an so I ran all the variables about discrimination against the variables which revealed social attitudes. And the pattern was clear, consistent, and strong all the way through. What we found was that the more traditional or orthodox your beliefs, the more likely you were to experience a lack of acceptance, and the less likely you were to experience a welcoming environment. So, for example, of those who agreed that who agreed that marriage was between a man and a woman, So only 51% of them agreed that they felt free to say what they thought. But those who disagreed that marriage was only between a man and a woman, 90% felt that they were free to say what they thought. So it was really consistent all the way through. The more I had loads of these tables, but the more you agreed with a conservative statement, the more likely you were to experience discrimination. And I think this is the source, that this result is likely to form a social divide. Those whose views don't challenge the status quo will not be on the receiving end of hostility and restrictions, and therefore they believe we live in a free and healthy democracy. And those who have experienced these restrictions know that we don't. Because the former have not experienced the intolerance and lack of acceptance which the latter have, they're likely to disbelieve it and think it's all to do with some conspiracy theory. And I think the link between social attitudes and discrimination may explain why discrimination against Christians has such a low profile. Most of our discrimination laws focus on protected characteristics which revolve around identity, such as age, sex, sexual orientation, ethnic background. But the discrimination Christians experience is on account of our beliefs and our expression of the beliefs. And Christians don't have an ethnic identity. We don't have a dress code or any way of identifying ourselves. This is actually part of our faith. There's no Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. You're all one in Jesus Christ. And this means that discrimination laws, which are based on identity, don't deal adequately with discrimination against Christians. So we need to place more emphasis on discrimination as a result of views and freedom of speech. So I think that the close relationship between social and attitudes and discrimination reveals the extent to which freedom of speech is absent from the public realm. If you look, it's also very linked to LGBT ideology. And I was looking if you look at Merriam-Webster's definition of religion, religion is a cause, principle, or system of beliefs held with ardor or faith. I think it would not be inaccurate to see LGBT ideology as having the status of a dogma or faith, or religion. And whether or not what you say fits in with the LGBT religion will determine how much you're allowed to speak. And so the LGBT religion does not allow anybody to say anything which goes against their faith. I think, Christians, I think those of us with a real faith, we can handle being spoken against, but the LGBT people really can't. And these are comments which people made. It was clear that no comment was permitted that disagreed with what is now referred to as LGBTQ matters. Christianity was considered narrow-minded, bigoted, old-fashioned, out of touch. I often receive hostility when I refuse to accept this ideology. This group seems to have all the legal rights to enforce their beliefs and policies on everyone, with nothing said. Yet when a Christian rejects their beliefs and policies, they face much criticism and threats from this group, with no support or protection from police or government powers. And you can see the math teacher promotes LGBTQ ideas with aggressive posters suggesting that if you don't agree, you are hateful. So it's just the extent, one lot of people can absolutely promote their ideology, and anyone who disagrees with it is not allowed any space in the, public realm at all. One of the things I just want to say, which is really a problem, is that the reason for we asked about discrimination, and an awful lot of the discrimination which Christians experience actually comes from the church, unfortunately. And it's a really tricky one, because the reason that Christians get discrimination in a different way from Muslims is because we're seen as being part of the establishment, because the Church of England sits in the House of Lords, it runs 4,600 state schools, it has some kind of share of public broadcasting, it's somehow part of the establishment. And we get coloured by that and experience discrimination as a result of that. Yet that very institution was repeatedly shown to be discriminating against Christians. These are just some of the quotes, and there were really a lot of them. So that's a real issue. Now, the next thing that I want to just briefly touch on is the fact that there was, I don't know if you know about, I'm not sure how much time I've got, but hold on. Oh no, actually, I'll come to that later. So the point that I want to make is, I think although, actually there isn't a slide for the next thing, but one of the things why I think that the discrimination Christians feel is of broad relevance is because a lot of the freedom of speech issues are actually happening to Christians at the moment, and I think this does show the sort of broader population that there are real issues with freedom of speech. You know, if you look at the examples, it tends anyway. So I think that's one thing. Although there was, Muslims have also done very good work with the schools and the sex education. Now, another point is, and I think this is again where the Christians and Muslims, there's a different thing going on, because if you look at the writings of the Frankfurt School, or if you look at the sort of early cultural Marxists, there was a particular aim, a particular desire to attack Christians in particular. If you read the writing, this is absolutely clear. And in the 1980s, there was a famous propaganda book called After the Ball by Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen. And it was all about how to make homosexuality an integral part of their culture. It was a planned psychological attack on America. And a lot of their ideas were actually to do with attacking They sort of planned ways of attacking Christians. They saw Christians as the enemy, and they actually wrote in their book how to deal with Christians. So they say, well, public opinion is one primary source, religious authority is the other. When conservative churches condemn gays, there are only two things we can do to confound the homophobia of true believers. It's always called homophobia. We can use talk to muddy the moral waters. This means publicising support for gays for more moderate churches, raising theological objections of our own about the conservative interpretation of Bible teachings, and exposing hatred and inconsistency. We can undermine the moral authority of homophobic churches by portraying them as antiquated, backwards, badly out of step with the times, with the latest findings of psychology. Another popular strategy they used to undermine the moral authority of the churches was to point out the moral failings of the churches and their leaders. Unfortunately, there were more than enough moral failings to keep the gay activists supplied with fresh ammunition. Anyway, so, and they also, I mean, they kind of developed this, and they gave an example of if one Christian said something, they put out, this is a series, these are all the comments, so this was, so there has actually been a specific thing to attack Christianity. So what's the last point? So I think that a thing that's really hit me is the extent to which there are double standards. So, for example, when I'm reading through reports, I find Christian-based charities, for example, they can't apply for funding because it means that they won't be able to say grace before a meal, or say the Lord's Prayer, or talk about Christ, even if they're only going to be doing this with people who are Christian anyway. They can't get funding. And yet we have charities which are paid millions by the government to go into schools and talk about sex and sexual relationships and so on. So we've got these really sort of double standards going on. And I just think it's like the establishment of an alternative religion. And if you don't agree with it, you're in trouble. I think that's the main.
Thank you, Belinda. Fantastic, wonderful.